I should say I actually started in school in music. I was actually in a music program myself, but I realized that after a few years at it, that the thing that most excited me about the school day in terms of what we had to do, the work we had to do in school, was actually when we had a physics practical. So, or a physics class. I was getting a bit of a buzz out of the idea of doing a physics class more than actually about doing the music class, even though I really liked the music and realized that I needed to swap over. But actually, that like Alex started in physics, and it stays with you. And so the kind of music thing stayed with me into my career as a scientist. So the things that actually started to capture my attention are cause and effect. If I do something, what will happen? So like the cars I talked about earlier on. Complexity. Why are things not predictable? We expect things to be predictable in science, but why are they not predictable sometimes in a deterministic sense, to say this is going to happen at this time in this place, rather than kind of on average, this is what's likely to happen. And I think in society, this is something that we still haven't really got a good grip on, is to accept that uncertainty is an inherent part of things that we do, even in science. We cannot just say, why don't you tell us the answer? Why don't you tell us precisely what's going to happen? In the cars example I've given you, you can see that it's actually almost physically impossible to give a precise answer. You give a set of possible scenarios, and we have to accept that uncertainty. Knowing what those scenarios are allows us to mitigate some risk, but it doesn't bring risk to zero. And I think that's one of the issues in society at the moment. We're looking for zero risk strategies in a lot of things we do. Zero risk doesn't exist. We cannot bring risk to zero. It just, no matter what we try to do, we have to accept some form of risk. And that's because there are uncertainty in systems. And that got me I was very interested in that. So I say science can't predict. But I guess a lot of people have probably actually done this quite recently. It's become quite popular to go sea swimming. But if you do this, you arrange this with your friends in advance. You say, hey, we're going to go, but we should go at high tide, because that way we can jump off the pier rather than just get in, and it's more fun to jump off the pier, right? So, but in order to do that, you have to look at a tide table prediction of when there's going to be a high tide. And you can look at that way out into the future. So some systems are actually inherently predictable, but other systems are not. And the question is, what's the difference between them? And by the way, high tide in Dunleary is at 5:42 today. If you're interested, I'm sure your teachers won't be too happy with that, but piece of information. But anyway, if anybody wants to go pier jumping. So what I'm going to show you is something that begins as if we're in the kitchen, but we're not. This is actually a science experiment. It's not a food experiment. And it's this idea of critically unstable systems, where lack of predictability comes in. These are rice grains just been dropped on top of each other on a saucer. And you can actually see the avalanches that occur. So there's an avalanche, wait, if you watch again, and here, just about to come up, there's another avalanche coming there. You see it? Predicting when those avalanches are going to occur is actually impossible. You can run this experiment for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, measure the number of avalanches, and you can say, on average, you're going to get an avalanche in a certain time window. But to actually say exactly when is impossible, because there's a thing called nonlinearity here. There isn't a direct relationship between the individual grain of rice that's been put on the pile and the response of the pile. You can put one grain on the pile, nothing will happen, or just a small avalanche. You can put the next grain on the pile, and it's just the straw that breaks the camel's back, and it can cause the whole thing to fail, and you get an avalanche. So that means that a small perturbation can cause a huge output, like the badly parked car or something, or a big perturbation where you can have several grains go on and not much happens. Big perturbations can have a small output, and it's very difficult. There's a lack of predictability in a system like that. It reminds me of a thing called nonlinear football, which, if you haven't heard of it, is fine because we just made it up today as an idea. So imagine you have a game. Everybody knows this. I don't necessarily like referring to sport all the time, but if you think everybody knows what this is, a football. Imagine a situation where we kick a football, And there is no relationship between how hard I kick it and how far it goes. Imagine if I kick it a little bit, just touch it, that it went flying. Or if I gave it a really hard belt, thanks, Alex, that if I gave it a really hard belt, that it just didn't go very far. That game would be absolutely unplayable. It's just unplayable because you couldn't estimate how hard you should kick it for how far you can go. You can see that would be a very, very complex game. But at the same time, obviously football isn't like that because we have people play football. But at the same time, even though it doesn't behave, individual rules don't behave like that, and football is playable. If you have two teams playing each other, you cannot say in advance who's going to win, even if one team's supposed to be really good and the other team are not so good. And like even the outcome of the game last night that people may or may not know about, nobody could say in advance what the outcome was going to be. But you could say what's probably going to be, but not exactly what it's going to be. So here we have another multi-agent system. So we have lots of players, 22 people on the field doing all this different thing, and the outcome is not predictable. You can say if you play again and again and again and again and again the same groups of teams, then the best teams bubble to the surface. That's called the league table, and the best teams end up at the top. But for a given realization, for a given game, you can't actually say what the outcome is going to be. More uncertainty, and you see where this uncertainty comes from. All of these interacting components that end up producing some sort of global behavior. In this case, the global behavior is how the team performs on that individual day. And that can be down to the details of some of the agents, how they interact. Sometimes people are off form, not communicating properly, all that sort of stuff changes the global outcome, okay? Now, the question is, what's the point in all this? Well, when we go back to the original diagram we saw, we can actually see that it does make a difference to how we understand, for example, the volcanic eruption. Why was that volcanic eruption not really predicted well? And the reason is because the subsurface of the ground, there's a lot of stuff going on with that kind of a multi-agent system.